Hi everyone, and welcome to today's talk as part of Sheffield Museums Live. Now, I'm very excited to say we're going to be talking about the latest exhibition at the Millennium Gallery. This is Cecil Beaton's Bright Young Things. And this is the exhibition that you're going to be able to see when we reopen next week on Thursday, the 20th of May. It's a wonderful selection of around 150 works that explores the very glamorous and joyful era of British cultural life in the 1920s and 30s, with portraits of society figures and artists and writers, all seen through the lens of renowned photographer Cecil Beaton in this exhibition from the National Portrait Gallery. And as usual for today's talk, if you have any questions or comments, just pop those in the comments box below. So we are joined today by Robin Muir, the exhibition's curator. Robin is contributing editor at British Vogue and consults on the historic Vogue archive and has published extensively on photography and fashion, including the books Vogue 100: A Century of Style, Norman Parkinson: Portraits in Fashion, and Unseen Vogue: The Secret History of Fashion Photography. So thank you very much for joining us, Robin, and a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Cecil Beaton. Cecil Beaton, who lived from 1904 to 1980, is one of the greatest creative figures of the British 20th century. He elevated fashion and portrait photography to an art form. As a cultural and social commentator, his observations on taste, decoration, and stylish living were eloquent. As an interpreter of celebrity, he was often devastatingly forthright. As a caricaturist, his drawings were razor sharp, and as an essayist, he was witty and fluent on a range of subjects. In Hollywood, his costume and set design earned him 3 Oscars, most famously for the film My Fair Lady, while his half-dozen volumes of sharply observed diaries give a unique and privileged insight into a century of cultural life. He photographed everyone from Edith Sitwell and Augustus John to Mick Jagger and David Hockney, from Wallace Simpson to Andy Warhol. But our exhibition, Beaton's Bright Young Things, is the story of Cecil's early years, the joie de vivre of the 20s and 30s, the jazz age, the age of modernism, the age of speed, the age of silver. It takes us chiefly from 1924 and Cecil's first pictures for Vogue to 1937, when he holds this magical fantasia of a party at Ashcombe, his Wiltshire home. The storm clouds are gathering over Europe already, and Cecil's famous party brings down the curtain on a frenetic and dazzling era. The bright young things, the children of the new century, had lived through one war, a new and grim mechanical form of warfare, and they came of age in a world deeply scarred. They would forever be compared, often unfavorably, to those older brothers, cousins, and uncles who never returned. Thus were they subject to a sort of collective guilt, a survivor's guilt for simply being alive. They were acutely aware they lived in a post-war world, but likely a pre-war one too. In an age of anxiety, the bright young things existed as a reaction to the formality, the stuffiness, the stifling conformity of pre-war manners, the stringency of dress codes, the conventionality of relationships, the regimentation of social interaction. And they reacted with a frivolity that might be seen as disrespectful, but they deemed it necessary and worthwhile. For Beaton, photography at this time is not about stripping back the surface to reveal the personality within. It's all about the surface. It's about pretense, a world of disguise and camouflage, make-believe and reinvention. It's not about the real me. Rather, it's about how dazzling, how luminous can I possibly be? And above all else, it's about the sheer exuberance that the magical world of photography could bring about. By practicing the art of artifice, Cecil elevated his friends to minor deities, exotic as rare orchids, iridescent, shimmering, otherworldly. But Cecil was also transforming himself. By the late 1920s, he was a celebrity in his own right, and his journey from middle-class suburban schoolboy to glittering society figure, the undisputed star of Vogue, revealed a social mobility unthinkable before the Great War. In 1923, shortly before Vogue first opens its doors to him, Cecil writes in his diary this very telling confidence. "I don't want people to know me as I really am, but as I'm trying and pretending to be." Thus would reinvention play a large part in defining who this mercurial, contrary figure was. Cecil was born in 1904, near the midpoint of Edward VII's reign, and so he's a child of the Edwardian era. He would often reference an early childhood memory as his introduction to both the seductive allure of feminine beauty and the means by which to capture it. At 3 years old, he was allowed to clamber into his mother's bed as she took her morning tea, and he would read her society magazines. And at some point, his eye also lit upon a hand-tinted, mass-produced photographic postcard of Lily Elsie, the toast of the Edwardian stage. "The beauty of it caused my heart to leap," he recalled. "The cheeks and lips of this divine creature were of a translucent pink that I could never hope to acquire with my box of crayons." As well as magazines, he started a collection of glitter-coated postcards of the leading ladies of Edwardian opera and theatre. "The first creatures," he said, "of artificial glamour I ever knew about." And this childhood would inform his outlook on life thereafter. The observations he made at an early age remained constant, he would say, while all around him, the world would change. And he was not above trying to put himself in the picture. His sets and costumes for My Fair Lady, perhaps his greatest achievement on stage and in film, were rooted in this memory bank of Edwardiana, memorializing the world of music hall comedy, his mother's ascot dresses and his aunt's picture hats. Cecil was born to comfort in leafy Hampstead, North London. His father, Ernest, ran a then flourishing timber business. But Cecil was dissatisfied with what he perceived as an ordinary upbringing, and he longed to escape it. "My ambition to break out of the anonymity of a nice, ordinary middle-class family certainly manifested itself in other tiresome outward forms, one of which was the pleasure I took in surprising or even shocking people by the inimitable way in which I adorned myself." At Christmas 1914, at age 10, Cecil was made a present of a box Brownie camera with which he attempted to portray his parents and his school friends as stars of the stage, rather in the manner of leading photographer Rita Martin, whose silvery tones he much admired. "The results were extremely poor," he wrote later. For his 12th birthday, he received a new camera, a folding Kodak A3, which produced, serendipitously, postcard-sized negatives, 6 to a roll of film. He would use this camera almost exclusively during his early years, up to and including his first years at Vogue. Most of the photographs in this exhibition were made on this still relatively primitive camera. Cecil's earliest sitters were those most conveniently to hand, his placid, pliable, endlessly patient sisters, Nancy, born in 1909, and Barbara, known as Baba, born in 1912. And here they are reflected in the lid of the family piano. They were sensitive to their brother's aesthetic, which became more sophisticated with the addition of various homespun props. He owed a debt of gratitude, he said later, to his long-suffering guinea pigs. "My sisters continued to show compassion to me in my mania, and at all times of the day and night were called upon to drape themselves in sheets and dust cloths." And you can see by this soon to be familiar brushstroke signature here in vivid lilac that he's in love early on with the notion of fame and recognition. And meanwhile, Cecil's mother, Esther Beaton, did not escape his attentions either. By the time he went up to St. John's, Cambridge in 1922, Cecil was proficient at taking photographs in poor light and under difficult circumstances, and he was beginning to master the art of printing. "Long after the rest of the household was asleep, I would work by the light of an electric bulb swathed in an old red shirt, awaiting the appearance of one perfect print." Cecil leaves Cambridge in 1925 without finishing his degree, having immersed himself in the world of undergraduate amateur dramatics, making scenery and costumes, but also acting to considerable acclaim. This is him in the prophetically titled review, All the Vogue, a performance which prompted one reviewer to hail him as one of our greatest actresses. And it's at Cambridge that he makes his first proper photograph, that is to say, of someone who's not a member of his immediate family. And this is he, the fledgling Orientalist, Stephen Runciman. Beaton first noticed Runciman at a lecture. He really is rather marvellous. I should adore to model him. He's so huge and ugly and strong, with the most fruity voice. Runciman, meanwhile, first noticed Cecil when he threw a cigarette out of his window, setting on fire a passerby's straw hat. Runciman radiated confidence, and dressing in a Chinese-style coat or holding a tulip, the young history undergraduate was a willing participant. The two had met through the university's amateur dramatic company. In fact, they played a mother and daughter together in one play. Student production was Cecil's primary occupation, academic work taking a distant second place. And at Cambridge, this production portrait of the Marlowe Society's Duchess of Malfi earned Cecil his first published photograph in Vogue. George Rylance, who played the Duchess, male undergraduates traditionally played all the roles, was photographed in the only available light, that outside the gentleman's lavatory of the amateur dramatic company's theatre. Cecil's Vogue P was 30 shillings, and within 3 years, he was under contract to the magazine. Meanwhile, this striking portrait of Cecil's childhood friend and rival in youthful undergraduate exhibitionism, Edward Boy Labasse, was published in the prestigious journal Photograms of the Year 1925. After Cambridge, Beaton was uncertain of his future, where to take his photography, or indeed if photography would work for him at all. Confiding this to a friend, one Carl Leng, Leng said prophetically, "I would not bother too much about being anything in particular, just become a friend of the Sitwells and wait and see what happens." Unlikely as it sounds, that is exactly what did happen. Edith Sitwell and her two brothers were the modernist iconoclasts of the day. In 1926, Cecil was taken to a performance of their entertainment, Facade, which he disliked, but he was emboldened to ask Edith Sitwell to lunch, with the possibility of a photographic session afterwards. He was amazed and delighted that she agreed. The lunch was apparently a disaster, but the photographs sublime. With Edith on board, Cecil fizzed with excitement. Here was the apotheosis of everything I loved, he said. Cecil reciprocated the kindness of Edith and her brothers with a body of inventive photographs that cemented their position as England's leading avant-gardists. For Edith, the transaction was a particularly graceful one. Beaton gave her an elegance she had not appeared previously to possess, while the poetess gave the ambitious photographer early focus and form to his art, and pictures that made his name. His portrayal of Edith as a figure from history, here a carved medieval effigy, delighted her. It chimed with her own view of her Gothic elegance and her regal descent. "I am a Plantagenet," she would declare, and her ambitions for the three Sitwells to be memorialized as a literary dynasty. Through Edith, Cecil acquired an entree to a world he'd observed from the sidelines, but dared not ever to hope to join. With the Sitwell seal of approval, society and the avant-garde beat a path to Cecil's door, or rather his parents' door, as he was still using the family drawing room as his makeshift studio. His sitters were tirelessly game as his scenarios became more bizarre. "My pictures became more and more rococo and surrealist," he wrote some 30 years later. "Society women as well as mannequins were photographed in the most flamboyant poses, in ecstatic or mystical states, sometimes the melodramatic air of a Lady Macbeth caught up in a cocoon of tulle. Ladies of the upper crust were to be seen in vogue fighting their way out of a hat box, or breaking through a huge sheet of white paper, or suffocating beneath a dome of glass. Backgrounds were equally exaggerated and sometimes, I must say, tasteless. In Cecil's own words, the uprise had begun. And when he met the dazzling Apollonian Stephen Tennant, the impossibly glamorous scion of an extremely wealthy family, and with a beauty that entranced young and old, he met the living embodiment of the bright young things. Beaton was in awe of Tennant's self-possession and his limitless imagination, which he would draw upon as he began to fashion his own life, the way he looked, as you can see here, and the way he behaved, around the example set by this golden-haired Shelley. Cecil was now in greater demand than ever. Exciting new friends appeared like mushrooms, he said, some brilliant in promise, others already eminent. They became willing sitters for my extremely unconventional photographs. His prints were passed around like contraband, and they were marveled at. Reality could be touched up or toned down according to whatever representation of reality the sitter or the photographer required. I couldn't believe that ever for one moment I've looked as beautiful as this, gasped Stephen Tennant. Cecil Beaton had arrived. His energy was relentless, his flattery abounding, his ambition unyielding. But it was his talent that served as his passport to a glittering world, an unexpectedly meritocratic one. This was the world to which the Hampstead schoolboy was first and instinctively drawn, and to which he felt he belonged. But Cecil's was an outsider's eye, scrutinizing, recording, marveling. If he'd been born to it, he might have been less perceptive of it. The outsider, having observed and pinned down the silvery world of the bright young things, survived to preserve its memory in the years long after it ceased to exist.
Perfect. Thank you. I really enjoyed that talk. That was really interesting. So we just have a time for a couple of questions now before we wrap up. So firstly, I've been fortunate enough to go and have a look at the exhibition during the installation. And what I noticed is there's a lot in there, and it's only covering the 20s and 30s. So would you say that, he was very prolific and presumably very hardworking?
Cecil's productivity rate was extraordinary. This is a career that lasted from, let's say, from 1924 in his first photograph to Vogue. He does his last photograph for Vogue in 1979. And in between that, he is a social commentator, he's a stylist. His taste in decoration and style is sought after by so many famous people. His diaries, as I mentioned before, are a sort of they just run the gamut of the century. He was an extraordinarily hard-working man, and you're right. We only touch upon the 20s and 30s. So by the time our exhibition ends in 1937, he's only 32, and he's achieved so much. And of course, what he goes on to achieve in barely a couple of years after that is that he becomes a royal photographer. Queen Elizabeth asks him to come take photographs of her at Buckingham Palace, and he kickstarts sort of bringing royalty into the modern age with those photographs. 1939 also sees him make a complete volte-face. He becomes attached to the Ministry of Information as a war photographer, and for the next 6 years, he roams the globe as a documentary photographer, photographing war work. So things happened early for him, and they continue to keep going for quite some time, and it's quite a career. And it doesn't end until he dies in 1980.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, yes, absolutely. And that sort of leads me on to the next question, is then how do you go about producing this exhibition and deciding which works get to go into it, and how do you represent all of his story?
Well, most exhibitions on Cecil are career-long retrospectives. They go from the 20s and they go up to the 1980s, and they take in Hollywood, royalty, fashion, portraiture. a whole lot. But we decided to concentrate specifically on the Cecil Beaton finding his way with photography, finding out what he can do with it. And as I said, probably in my talk, it's more about what photography can do for him as he tries to escape this sort of rather tiresome, he feels, middle-class upbringing. Well, exhibitions like this take a long time. It took us 4 years maybe to track down the items we wanted. We were very, very clear at the beginning. What we didn't want to do was to make sort of giant, modern black and white blow-ups. We wanted to go right back and try to bring you the actual photograph that Cecil took for Vogue, to give to his friend Stephen Tennant, to show Edith Sitwell. We wanted to go right back to those photographs. So you see on them, if they're slightly creased or marked or torn, they have the sort of patina of age, which I think adds to the history of them. So we really wanted to find these relics and put those on the wall rather than do some modern prints. And that's why it takes time to try and track them down. I was very lucky to be able to go to Chatsworth to find things, to Renishaw, which I know is very near you guys. The Met lent some items. I mean, private collectors we found had things. We went through Phillips and Christie's to try and locate stuff that they'd sold over the years. And so we were able to, apart from, of course, Sotheby's Cecil Beaton Archive, which is an extraordinary repository of Cecil's work, we were able, by bringing in all those disparate strands, to bring what we hope is a sort of representative exhibition of Cecil's early years.
So we've just got time for one last question here. What sparks your love for Beaton and his work, and what is it about his photography that resonates with you so much?
Oh gosh, what a question. I think it's very hard to find anybody else that represents, well, not just photography in Britain, but the whole history of 20th century Britain is encapsulated in one man. From 1906 to 1980, he photographs everybody. And I'm just in awe of the immense talent he has as a writer, and I've said it before, as a writer, as a painter, as a set designer. He's a guy that wins 3 Oscars. His set design he took set design to an art form, and of course his photography, his fashion is wonderful, and as ever, fashion does often reflect the times. So you get a pretty good overview of cultural life by looking at the fashion pictures, but also his portraits have, as he goes older and gets more experience, his portraits begin to have real depth, and he really does bring out what it is about the person he's photographing. He's an immensely clever man, and no, it's an absolute privilege to work with work of this caliber. Just fantastic.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. It was great to get this insight into the early life of such a fascinating character. And it is a wonderful exhibition that will be in place at the Millennium Gallery until Sunday, the 4th of July. So do go down and have a look at it. There is a lot more in there that we haven't had a chance to cover today. We will also be continuing with some more virtual talks and tours as part of Sheffield Museums Live. So do keep an eye out for what's coming up next. And thank you all for watching.